Oh, thank you for people in the comments who let me know that everything looks okay to them. Okay, and yeah, it is 2 minutes past, which is already later than I like to start things. So let's kick things off. Welcome to the second edition of Camunda Question Corner, where Niall gets bored at home and makes people listen to him for a little while. As always, our plan is to help you guys understand the things that you have questions about. People have already asked some questions beforehand, and we'll ask them now. I'll explain how it works shortly, but first of all, let me introduce the two people who you'll be hearing talking. The first, of course, is myself on the left there. I'm Niall. I'm a developer advocate for Camunda, and generally speaking, I bounce around trying to create tutorials, help people use Camunda. Usually the open source version is my specialty. And of course, I'm joined by Nele.
Hi. Nice to be here. Yeah, I'm a consultant at Camunda. I was here the last 2 weeks ago, and I'm happy to join again this time.
Great, thanks a lot, Nele. So, what will we do today? It'll be pretty straightforward. Over the last week or so, whenever I put it up live, we started taking questions from Slido, and then they were voted on. And then myself and Nele decided to find some of the questions that we enjoyed and prepare some answers for them. So we'll do that at the very beginning. We picked about 6 questions, I think, in the end. And at the end, we will, a second part is we'll spend the last, oh, someone can't hear us. That's terrible news. If that could be, I think we should be able to be heard. Yeah, I would restart it. Yeah. If anyone has problems hearing me, then it's probably their problem. Yes, so the second part, of course, is where we're actually taking questions from you lovely people. You can add those to the chat. There's already been some added, and we'll try and do a quick fire answering of questions. So there's the plan. Hopefully this will be useful for you guys, and let's kick things off. So yes, this is a question that I chose to answer, and it's an important one because I actually wrote a blog post a few minutes that's due to go up soon with this regard, so I'm going to summarize it slightly. It's the trade-offs between the different distros that we use. Camunda has a very interesting, very interesting scenario in which you can kind of decide on the best way to actually use Camunda. Now here it's got a bunch of different things, like in the question it's got Wildfly, Tomcat, JBoss, but actually that's not the way. It's not the best way of thinking about it. The distros essentially come in 3 different parts. The first one, which is the one you would get if you go and download Camunda from the download page, is you would have the container managed engine. This is Camunda deployed to Wildfly or Tomcat or some kind of application server. It's probably the most common way Camunda has been used over the last few years, and generally people use it if they want to deploy multiple processes. So let's imagine you have multiple teams all working on different processes, let's say, and you want to deploy them to exactly the same container to manage it easier. Well, no problem, you can have the centralized container. So you see here that if you want to deploy multiple applications, if you like Java, these containers are generally configured through Java, so Tomcat, Wildfly. If you want to use libraries and things and additional, you can use this container. It's a very, very nice thing. You don't have to use Java, you can use either external tasks or Java directly. Doesn't really matter too much, but generally Java needs to be a preferred language because that's where a lot of the communication shows up. Already, if you already sort of understand how containers work, it's already part of your system, you can go ahead and use it. So that's a really common one. The next one, slightly newer and probably more popular, is using Camunda as part of Spring Boot. So this, in the first idea is you have you have Camunda deployed to container, you have your application here, and you kind of just mush those things together, and then you get yourself your working application. Spring Boot's a little nicer than that. You basically would deploy the engine with your application together, which means usually you would have one sort of process application, one project with an application per Spring Boot, application per engine. Usually Java is preferred because it's Spring Boot. So usually if Java is your main focus, then Spring Boot's a great idea. All the engines can run independently, so you can have lots of Spring Boot engines all running with different processes. And generally speaking, if you want to use Java delegates, like beans, Spring Boot's a really good option. Now, interestingly, we have a third option that is kind of only just available as of recently, and that is Camunda BPM Run, also known as Little Camboot. This is actually a sort of an attempt to create a standalone engine that is not that can be configured entirely without any Java. So in this scenario, you would deploy your models and your business logic independently, which means Camunda Run sits there as a sort of shared engine. You deploy your models to it, and then you use the external task pattern. You don't need any Java at all. At the moment, all of the configuration can be done directly. Camunda Run will be officially released, I think, at the end of this month. It's already available on Alpha. There's a blog post on it. I'll link to that maybe afterwards. And there'll be a lot more coming around that. So just to recap, the distributions that you could choose from would be container managed, which is fine, Java orientated. You can kind of do a lot of stuff with that. Spring Boot, embedded. Java is required essentially, and you can use Java classes, and then Little Camboot or Camunda Run, in which you can actually use an independent non-Java orientated system for running your business logic. Okay, so hopefully that answers the question. Any follow-up questions to that, please put them in the answers, the ask of the question, and I'll see if I can get to it. So thanks, Shirish. Are you actually on the call? Let's see. I'm sure you'll watch it at some stage, but thanks for the question. It was very, very well placed. So let's go on to the next one. Great, we got John Array has asked me how to simply integrate Camunda with the standalone AMQP, like RabbitMQ or something like that. So, okay, now this is quite a common question. The exact technology used doesn't matter as much as the pattern. Now, luckily, I didn't have to do too much work with this one because this lovely picture already exists. And here's kind of what we're talking about. We have a queuing mechanism here that's usually used across the architecture, but not just Camunda. Lots of stuff is publishing messages, and lots of stuff is picking those up and continuing. In what tends to happen is we want to send a message, like ship goods, to our system, and then we want to wait for a response so we can continue.
Niall,
now, yes, go ahead.
Quick sign, we cannot see your slides. I just see the start slide, and I think it's not supposed what it should be. I think you have, yeah, here we go.
There we go. Thank you for that, Nele. And just in case people were wondering, this is the other slide that I wanted you to use. Take a screenshot, put it on your wall. It's a slide I took literally minutes creating, so it's definitely worth staring at for a few minutes. Thanks, Nele. So this is actually, so hopefully right now you should be seeing, there it is, great. You should be seeing the proper slide there. So this is actually the design, the architecture around AMQP, RabbitMQ sort of queuing mechanism as part of the architecture. You can see here that shipping goods sends a message, it arrives here, and then a really important part about coming back. So I'll explain later why I won't go into this in too much detail, but basically a really big pitfall when using this architecture is missing out this thing here. Because you can send a message here and then really quickly do a thing and send a message back to tell the process to continue. But messaging systems can be really, really fast, and a process can do a whole bunch of things in the thread before it reaches from here to here. So very often, sometimes a message might fail to return. So it's a good idea to have a listener here that can implement sort of retries and things and pick up these messages as they come along. Now, luckily, as I said, this wasn't me who created this. An example already exists that was created by Camunda's own co-founder and my dear colleague and my favorite co-founder, Bernd Rucker. So he created this example. So if you want to take a look at it, I'll drop this in the chat afterwards. And hopefully we can, you can take a look at that to give you further examples and then actually run the code yourself. Okay, how am I on time, Nele? I'm doing all right? Yeah, fantastic. Last time we separated the time very evenly between myself and Nele, and I decided to take up most of it. So this time I'm being very, very focused. Okay, so this was one that came in from Clemens. I liked this question a lot. It came in a little later, but I quite like the idea. So this is a really common question, and it can sometimes be overlooked as a BPMN solution. So later on, Niall's going to answer a question about when to deal with things on the engine level and when to deal with them on the BPMN level. But this is an issue in which we do a whole bunch of stuff to an object over the course of multiple steps, and then we have some kind of failure. How do we make sure we can undo this? So this is luckily pretty okay. BPMN has a method for this. I built this morning. So this is a little model that basically would explain how that might work. Now, in this is a whole bunch of really complicated symbols, but they're really, really easy to implement and they make a lot of sense. So let me talk through it. So when the process begins, we might have this object, this data object, and we're changing the name of it. Then, of course, we might change the address and then change the email. Now, let's imagine some sort of validation fails in the email. It's not a correct email address. Well, this is going to fail, and you want to revert the address and the name as well. Now, if this was a single thread, this isn't a problem. It would just roll back and you would get things saying it can't do that. But in architectures where you have external tasks or you have transaction boundaries, this has been committed to the database already. These changes have been made. So how do you undo them? Well, you can use BPMN error messages to throw an error message that can be caught by an event subprocess like this, and then throw a compensation event. So what does this mean? The compensation event will then look at all the successfully completed tasks. So if the email one failed, it would mean it would look at this one and this one because they're both successful, and it would then run the corresponding revert. So that way we would change it back and the process would end. It's quite a nice system, and it is very easy. The really cool thing about this is if it fails a change address, it'll only revert the name change. So this is universal. If you had a very big process with lots of different rollbacks, all you would need is this pattern with the way to compensate it and the way to catch it. It's a code example of this is available, I'm pretty sure, on the GitHub for the consultancy team. If not, I'll try and make one and put it up. But I'm fairly sure I've made a few of these examples in the past, so hopefully that's useful for you. Because I missed that slide in the beginning, I want to just clarify again about the differences here of these three things. Look at them, enjoy, pick your favorite. That said, I did spend a good 10 minutes in the slide, so I do want to make sure it gets some publicity. Okay, as a sort of a random side note, I got a question just at the very beginning by Olga. I appreciate people who are early for things, and this question was sent in before the webinar started, so I'm going to just answer it really quickly. It's about diffing, so I'm just going to show you guys this. I think Olga asked specifically about how do I know what has changed in my model. If you upload your model into, this is a new model, I just uploaded this into Cavimo, so cavimo.com if you want to use it. It has a diffing tool already where you can say show milestone history, and then I'll be able to see the difference between this version and then a previous version that I had. And you can see that this has been added, this has been changed, this has been edited. So I would suggest, Olga, if you want, upload the model into Cavimo, it'll then show the diffing. Yeah, so that's how that works. So that's a bonus question for somebody who shows up early. There's always advantages to showing up early. Okay, so I'll stop showing now and I'll pass it along to Nele. So yeah, all yours.
Okay. Let me start my presentation. I'm not sure which screen you see.
We see Hawks versus Eagles, and we see it as a.
Then it's good. Yeah. Okay. So that's the first question I got, Hawks versus Eagle. I think Suraj had this question, and I really had to think about this last night. And I found out that eagles are stronger than hawks. And I also found out that Niall already has a hawk. So kind of that makes me go with the eagle, I think, because if the hawk already is occupied, I might probably need to train an eagle for the next version in the question corner. So I tried with eagle this time. Okay. We had a bunch of questions reaching us about Camunda Standalone, and I tried to put them together so that we answer them all together in this slot here. And the first question, or the first what we have to see, or again, is the architecture here of a standalone engine. So you can imagine you have your engine somewhere deployed, and then you have all those different application services there somewhere. You could imagine they are all written in different languages. Maybe one of those guys will do the deployment. Another of those will start the process, and another one is an external worker working on the process. That is like the standalone version of the engine that exists. And now there are some interesting questions regarding this architecture pattern, actually. And I think they were all handed in by John Array. I hope you're on this call. So the first thing he asked was how to, or is it possible to test processes in Camunda standalone? And for that, again, I showed that picture the last time as well. We have to think about the test scopes we have. And actually, when we think about testing our process models, we are in the first scope, what we can see here. And what we need to test is our process, without any job executor, but we want to see how the engine will proceed this process. And honestly, the best way to do that right now is to write a JUnit test if you want to do it programmatically. And that could be a problem in the engine again, because if I jump back and if I say one of those external workers here is responsible for the deployment, and that worker has no Java logic at all because the worker is written maybe in Python or some other languages, then it is hard to write a test for the process engine itself and for the process model. It could be, but it could be also a standalone version or a mix between a standalone version engine and an embedded engine, where the deployment might still be taken care with a Java worker. And then it would be possible to write your JUnit test for the process model, basically. And maybe if we look one level more up, so if we would have level 0 of this whole model, not 2 or not 3, if we just look on the model itself, there's a tool that we have in BPMN.io, and that's our linting tool. Here you see a screenshot of that, and that's not really helping to see or test the process, how the engine will proceed it, but at least you can give, or it can help you to understand if your model has some problems or if you have some errors in your model. So that would be one level up to test your model for a syntax check. That's something you could do if you decide not to go for any Java version. Other than that, testing can be tricky in that environment, definitely. The other question related to that is how common is standalone implementation of Camunda? Are there any case studies implementation in larger companies available? Actually, I asked a question to some colleagues and no one was really aware of a case study that we have and that we are allowed to talk at the moment. What I can say, what is really common at the moment is to have maybe an embedded Spring Boot engine that is started where you can test your process models, and then the work is handed over to external task clients. So you have a minimum of Java for the deployment and for your processes, but then the business logic of the process is handled by external workers, so to say. And then there was another follow-up question. What would be the key points to convincing non-Java companies to build own app with embedded Camunda instead of standalone? Does this even make sense? That's an interesting question. If you are not a Java developer and if you want to convince someone to use Java, I think it's a hard way to go, and probably it's not a good idea. And I found this funny comic here. It's the other way around. So this is a Java family, and I think it's not a good idea to take someone out of the environment they are used to and start or making them using something else. That could lead to frustration, I would say. So better don't. Then there were two questions about handle errors in our Slidos, and the first one here is how to handle error on send mail activities. Is there a queuing system that can be put in place? If the mail service is down, the mails will wait in the queue. Actually, what we have in the engine is not a queue, but what we can do is we can have a retry mechanism. And you see it here in the properties panel. If you would select the task and then you see the ID and the name, that's everything okay, a delegate expression. And if you look down where the red square is, you can set your retime cycle. And in this case, we say retry for 3 times in the period of 10 minutes. And maybe it's interesting to know what is the natural or the default setup for the engine. The default setup for the engine is that it will always try 3 times shortly after each other. But here you have the possibility in the property panel to set your own retime cycle. So here you can use that. And there's a related question actually, is when should I use BPMN error events versus leaving it to the engine to handle? And maybe now if I open the modeler, we can imagine again that we have our sending email task here. And well, that's it. And we already, well, let's say we define it as that we want to have a retry circle here. Maybe we want to retry it for 3 times. That's what I said before. And then we say, okay, if we could not reach it after the 3rd time, then we want to do something else. And if we don't put something here, what will happen actually is that the engine will create an incident. So we will see the indicator that something is broken in the engine. But what would be the other possibility is to say, okay, if this allows, or if our project, if our business project logic allows us to handle this differently, what we can then do is attach an error event here. So here we can say, okay, this is an error, mail sending failed. And what we want to do instead is we want to give the task to a user, and the user should phone the customer. And then we end our process here, whatever this, or this is just a snippet of a bigger process. So the question always is, if you want to create a BPMN error, who is the user of your process, and does it make sense for your business logic that someone of your process users will take over that task? Or maybe you have another service that can take over the task. That could be another scenario here. Okay, and I think if I go back to the questions, now we have some time to answer some questions from the channel.
Okay, great going, Nele, super fast. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So I've got one that's kind of a bit different from the other questions we got. This was about what are the steps to become a Camunda expert on the tool? Where should you start if you've already worked other tools, other BPMN tools? Expert is very relatively innocuous term, but it's very hard to know, because I think Camunda has so many different ways of implementing things. The key thing would be understanding the engine's Java API, deal with it. So I would suggest, if you wanted to really get into the in-depth knowledge of how Camunda works, I would personally want to create a bunch of Spring Boot projects. In Spring Boot, you can work directly with the engine's API. And the reason that's important is because then you also have a scenario where if you want to use the REST API, you can do that too. That's no problem, because the Java API is, the REST API is based off the Java API. So anything you learn through understanding the Java API can also be done by the REST. Probably the most important thing to learn when it comes to actually understanding how a model really works is transactions. Transactions in the engine and how it moves the token, where it commits, what happens if you change the point of where it commits, are fundamental. They give you so many new features and understanding. If you've already known the BPMN standard, it's a good idea to understand some of the more complicated symbols, like we talked about compensation earlier. So that would be, so in conclusion, I gave a really bad answer to a pretty good question, which is learn all the things, but reality start with the Java API and just understand how to do the complicated things with BPMN and notation and understand transactions. Okay. Nele, do you want to take one here? It's about the pros and cons of using delegate expressions over expressions or what's it called, Java classes in service tasks. Or shall I take that one? You've gone quiet now, Nele. I assume you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah. Now I can talk. Yeah. So you can take it if you want to. I cannot open the questions. I have some problems here with seeing them, actually.
No problem. I will. There's actually a link to them on the first slide, so you can find it that way. So maybe, Nele, do you want to let me share my screen for a moment? And then I can just demonstrate this. So you have to stop sharing your screen for that to happen. Fantastic. So let's see if I can share my screen then. I cannot. This thing is really not my friend today. Yeah, Nele's gone mute. I don't know. Wonder why. Any ideas?
Wait, I have an idea. Can you try it again?
There we go. Thank you. Okay. So here I have the process from earlier, and there's a few different ways of implementing each of these tasks. You can see here that we have delegate expression, Java class, and external and stuff. I won't talk about these guys just yet. Never use this one. Connectors drive me nuts. Now, that's a personal opinion, so there are some disagreements there, but basically I hate connectors. So let's talk about these guys here. So generally speaking, if you are using Java classes and your logic is in Java, you really should be considering only two options, Java class and delegate expression. Okay, so what are the difference? If you select Java class, you actually need to you actually need to put the qualified name of the class. Thing. So you would type in com.example.camunda.thing. That is the class. That is where that goes. Which means when the token arrives there, it'll find a class with this qualified name and then run it, which is great. There is a massive downside to this, and that is if you do any sort of refactoring on the on your code side. So like, let's say you see your project, like me, you've spelled, let's say, Camunda wrong, you forgot the M. That's a disaster. You rename your package. Well, unfortunately, that may not be picked up by the model because this is essentially hard coded into the XML, which would mean that you could potentially break it. So it's usually, if you can avoid it, I would. So how do we avoid that with delegate expressions? With delegate expression, instead of pointing the Java class, you would actually have an expression, hash open curly bracket. Everyone can see my screen, yeah, great. And then you would have the let's say name of bean here, and this would be some kind of bean, CDI bean or a Spring Bean or whatever. And the cool thing is that it doesn't rely on the package name at all, which means that it would just call the name. This is really common to be used in Spring Boot, really common to be used in let's say Java Enterprise, Wildfly, for instance, using that. It's way easier to call a named bean because then the refactoring doesn't have that big an issue. And also, if you want to deprecate an old class, you can just change the name to a new one. So it's a little better. So I would generally do that. Expression, generally, I don't come across this being used very often at all in service tasks. But if you wanted to do a very basic calculation and it was worth a service task, you can do it. But really, if you're calling any sort of code that's in any way complicated, I would avoid using delegate expression. Okay. Nele, did you see any questions there that you would like to jump on?
I have one, but this seems to be, that's from Mauricio, that seems to be something that we could consider the next. He says, hello, Niall and Nele. In your opinion, what is the best configuration for a DevOps workflow like Jenkins, Sonar, Terraform for those who use Java or JavaScript in external tasks? Please consider this as a suggested topic for the next session, considering different deploy scenarios to AWS or Azure. I think it might be, or I would need some preparation for that question. I don't know if you have something to say, just right straight.
Sure. Well, like off the top of my head, a lot of those things don't have a direct impact from Camunda's side. So for instance, if you're interested in using Jenkins and you know how to use it, absolutely use it. If you want to use Travis, that's fine. The engine doesn't really care too much. It's not really involved. In terms of AWS or Azure, again, the engine is usually not that concerned about the platform you deploy it to, as long as you can get the settings right. I haven't really looked into it in a huge amount, but you can sort of give it a shot. You just try it out and see if it works, because generally speaking, a lot of people have used combinations of this that I couldn't even fathom because we're not fully told about all the different deployments of Camunda. Yeah, I agree. Maybe we'll take that to next time. Thanks, Mauricio. And greetings to my dear Brazilian friend. Hope you're doing well. Brazil, of course, has the second biggest Camunda community, I think, for meetups in the world, right? And that Mauricio is a big part of that, so thank you very much. Okay. There's one there about DMN, Nele. Do you know offhand if you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. The question here is that everybody understands it. Can we receive DMN output onto a Java delegate service? And can I share again my screen?
Oh, sure. Let me stop sharing. There you go.
Now that should work. And again, if we have a model here, I think you all see the modeler, I hope.
It's all good.
Let's have a different one here. I hope that answers the question the way it is. If not, please ask a follow-up question. So if we have here the output table and say we want to decide something really important here, what we would do here, again, is we would link it to a DMN table. Well, I don't have it, of course, right now, but we could imagine it is there. And here I would store the result variable. Actually, that is the output of my DMN table, and I could just name it result here. And then I have to decide, what actually in which format is the result. So if I just have a single value, I would go for single entry type value. That would be my output value. And then, of course, this will be given back to the process. So the engine will create the variable result, and the result will contain the output of that decision table. And then, of course, if I have a next service task here, and if I use then a Java delegate in that service, I can then just use the process variable that I have created in the output variable here for the table to use it in that service. So I hope that answered the question. Okay.
Thanks, Nele. Can I take the screen back again off you? I want to do. I got a question I'm interested in answering.
You can.
Thank you. I got a question there from Aravinda, who is another very prominent member of the forum, and it's a really good one. I'm not sure exactly the perspective in which he's talking about. Let me explain the question. How does parent process compensate the transaction failure in a call activity, and how to handle the parent process compensates due to subflow compensation? What this is actually talking about is to do with transactions with regard to processes that call other processes. So let's first describe how a process like this would work. If I start this process, and let's say there's no transaction boundary, these are all Java classes, what will happen is this will run through this process. If it fails, it'll just roll all the way back, and then we're good. Things get a little more complicated if we have, or they would appear to, some code, if we have a call activity, because this says call another process. So let's imagine that process is over here, and let's say it's a bunch of Java classes as well. Okay, let me see how quickly I can build this. Okay, great. So what happens is this guy here, let's say this guy here runs, then it calls this, and this subprocess here is actually calling this. This will be in a different diagram, but don't worry about it. So interestingly, and this is again, this is another question that I think is validates the earlier thing I said about learning about how transactions work in Camunda. Because if you start this process, the transaction will run this code, and it won't commit, so the transaction is open still. It'll then go into the sub process, and then it'll actually keep running. So the same transaction that runs this code will also run this one and this one, which means if this fails, if from a technical error, like a null pointer or something weird like that, it'll actually roll back to the end of this process, back into the parent process, and back into the beginning, which is pretty cool, because it means that you can then call these things transactionally in that way. Now, there's a non-transactional version of this, and maybe I think Aravinda had that in mind, which is about compensation. So let's say this code needs to be compensated. And so we have this guy here, and there we go. Let's say we have this. So let's imagine that we need to compensate this if anything fails beyond it. Now the thing is, if this thing here fails, it needs to actually tell the parent process from inside here to compensate this because this has failed. And so the way you can do that is you can have this thing throw a BPMN error in code, and then you can actually do something like this, catch that error, and then throw a compensation. So that means that anything that happens that makes this thing fail will trigger a compensation in everything that happened before it. So that way you can compensate it. So the two different techniques. This one here is where you've got sort of asynchronous asynchronous stuff between your tasks. The first option, where everything just rolled back itself, is where everything is totally synchronous, where there's no transaction boundaries. So that would be Java classes, totally synchronous usually. Calling external task pattern is always asynchronous. Okay. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. Have you got anything else there, Nele, before we move? We got 5 minutes, and I kind of want to talk about the events. You're on mute at the moment, actually, Nele.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Am I? Can you hear me?
You aren't now. You're good now. Yeah.
Perfect. Actually, we have a very a question that seems to be very important. That's about there is a actually we have deployed Camunda Spring Boot service into OpenShift. When service deployed simultaneously, it creates two deployments with same version. And when we correlate using message name, we got errors says more than one process instance found. This is our very hot issue now. Please take this question.
Yeah, this is a question that's been on the forum actually. So the issue is almost certainly with the database read commit setting, probably. It's very hard to know because there's a lot of moving factors, but the only thing that could have done this is if two transactions were deploying at the same time from two different nodes or something, and the database wasn't properly isolated per transaction. So I would say there's a database setting almost certainly messing that up. The message thing is a bit of a misnomer. That's not really part of the duplicate deployment. That's probably a later on problem. But the duplicate deployment probably happens entirely because of that. It's a very weird error. I haven't seen it before. It's definitely worth. I was going to check it out in more detail, but because there's so many different parts in that, it's hard to initially nail down what it could be, but probably I would guess it's database settings. Look at the driver and make sure that you're using the correct read committed setting, and then that should probably work it out. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, and I want to take that. Am I still sharing my screen, right? Fantastic. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. Thanks everyone for the questions. I do greatly appreciate it. We would not have this lovely little event if it weren't for your questions. So thank you very much. But as well, I just thought I'd let you know if you have any further, these little 45-minute sessions can only answer so much. And so we're planning a bunch more stuff to help you guys out. That's completely free. So some free events that we have coming up. The big one, of course, is Camunda Con Live. On the 23rd and 24th of August, we're going to have an online conference.
Wait, is it not April?
You know what? It's April. Yeah, it is.
I don't want to wait so long.
You know what the problem was? Do you know why I put August? I had the emperor, the Roman Emperor Augustus in my head from earlier. I just typed August. So
and no one asked a question about Roman history. I know how upset that must be.
Literally devastated by that. I'm ashamed of all of you. You know what's even worse? I had a poll for the best Roman emperor, and Marcus Aurelius was #1. I mean, are we all Stoics in the Camunda community? I mean, how did Augustus get 0 votes? He was by far the best emperor. Well, not by far. Trajan had it close. Anyway, sorry, let's get out of that. Ignore this. This shouldn't say August. This is April. This is coming up this month. These are both this month. So we have Camunda Live this month in April, followed by, we have another question corner, which this week is going to be 3 weeks from now because of CamundaCon. We'll put up the questions for that. But if you want a sort of a more hands-on event on the 19th of May, I'm almost certain it's May. Next month is May, right? Nele, you can verify that.
Yeah, I can verify, yeah.
The next April followed by May. We're actually going to do a little sort of hack session. It's going to be 3 hours of just building a process and getting to grips on how to sort of start to use Camunda. It'll be more of a beginner's sort of session, but it'll be free to join, build a little thing with the community, and then hopefully understand a little something about that. That'll go, the announcement on that is going to go live on, I think soon. I'm actually too afraid to say dates now that I've screwed that up so much that I'm actually just afraid of what potential lies I could tell. So I'll just, at some point in the future, this will be announced, and just keep an eye on the forum or Twitter for that sort of thing. Yeah, and I think, and so we'd like you to join that as well. If your question didn't get answered, I'm very, very sorry. Please put it in the next chat. There was a question I wanted to answer about JSON objects and versus defined Java classes. It's just a very complicated answer, so I didn't really have time to define something, but I'll definitely throw that in next time. Any other questions, do feel free to join us to add those, and then we'll hopefully be able to do that. So with that, I've got 1 minute. Great, that's good timing. So it's enough for me to say thank you very much, Nele, for joining us for this. Of course, thank you for Luca behind the scenes, who was telling me that my screen wasn't moving forward, but I didn't see those messages, so thanks for that. Do you want to say hello, Luca? No, Luca's very shy.
Yeah, I'm really shy. Yeah,
yes.
So great webinar, great question corner, Nele and Niall, and thank you all for joining, and see you next time, hopefully then.
Yeah, thanks again, everybody, and feel free to join the forum and join one of our events. Thanks again, Nele, and see you guys next time. Bye-bye.